Welcome to the World on Fire podcast. I am your host, as always, Nick Schweitzer. I guess we can also say welcome to the new year, right? I hope all of you were able to get out and celebrate the end of 2023 and the beginning of 2024. I know us here at the World on Fire podcast are excited for what this year with some of the things down the road. But we're going to get all of that as time gets closer. With that being said, for those of you who are now listening on our YouTube channel, also welcome. Before we dive into the episode, I just kind of want to reiterate once again that I'm going to lean on the side of caution here, right? So, all of the information that we will hear in this episode today is for you to formulate your own ideas and your own in depth research of Georgy Zhukov, especially after the fall of the Axis powers in 1945, which is what we're going to be discussing today. Take all of this information with a grain of salt, as you should with any research, right? We love research. However, it is important to understand that you need to take it with a grain of salt every single time. And the reason why this is more important with Zhukov's life and career is it's incredibly expansive, right? And very much a mystery in many senses that we can only take what we have, which are what like memoirs, personal letters, and we'll say surviving documents. We have to remember that not only in the Soviet Union, but around the world, critical information would be destroyed either during the Second World War or immediately following the Second World War. Now that the disclosure's out, let's wrap it up and just get right into the episode, right? Welcome to our final episode on the life and career, the Marshal of Victory, Georgy Zhukov. I am certainly going to set the stage here because if I do not, most of this will seriously not make any sense, right? So when the war in Europe ended, it created a whole other issue. Western allies, mainly us here in the United States, were not really keen on Europe potentially becoming a communist continent, right? They weren't really big on that. They were not big on communism. If you know anything about American history, you will understand really immediately after World War II, kick up the Red Scare, communism's a no-go in the U.S. or to the 99% of the population. Then the reason why is Western allies believed that communism was in fact a threat to global democracy, which is what America likes to spread. This can and will be expanded on in a later series when we discuss the choice behind the use of atomic weapons against Japan. But the fear of the Soviet Union also getting an occupational piece of Japan in a peace treaty in the Pacific Theater did, in fact, help force the issue of utilizing these weapons. Like I said, we're gonna do that on a different episode. So by this point, the war is now over, and you now have this massive melting pot of power occupying and attempting to not only restore the European people, but also to prosecute those responsible. There is a very large power struggle, as I mentioned, and not only is the entire country of Germany split into four sectors, that would be the French, the American, the British, and the Soviet. This is an interesting piece. The French sector was actually a piece of off the American sector, would split it into three ways. However, if you know anything about the United States, France is our closest ally throughout history. So we felt like they also deserved, and the British and the Soviets were like, yeah, sure, well, you can give up some of your zone, if you will, and they can have that. And that's exactly what happened. But not only did it happen within Germany, within the Soviet zone sat the city of Berlin, right? It sat the capital city. In that, Berlin was also broke up into an additional 4 sectors. So it's confusing, right? You've got these zones all over the place. And you know, it's kind of like, and it's not, it's really the British, the French, and the Americans are all working on the same page. Soviets, on the other hand, are not. It's these occupational zones are ran completely different from one another. So, in a way, right, there's a line in the sand already. And this is obviously what boils into what we know as the Cold War, right? It's the West versus the Soviet Union. Now, as I said in the most previous episode, Zhukov was one who was handed the official surrender of Nazi Germany on behalf of the Soviet Union in Berlin, right? He was one of the he was the first commander into Berlin, right? He led his troops into Berlin. He accepted the surrender of Nazi Germany in Berlin. So it only seemed right that after the Nazis capitulated, Zhukov would become the first commander of the Soviet occupational zone. And it is from this point that we tend to see a major shift in Zhukov's personal and professional life. As we stated, right, this is a man who made his entire career out of bearing arms and defending, in the beginning, Imperial Russia, but the biggest piece of it, right, defending the Soviet Union. And not only that, during that time that he was the face of the Red Army's leadership in defeating the Nazis, right? So he's on a different level comparative. He's not just the military, right? Zhukov's in the military. No, he was the guy who got it done. Saying that Zhukov's social status within the Soviet Union elevated after their victory in the East against the Nazis would be a massive understatement. Stalin would actually bring Marshal Zhukov to Moscow in June of 1945 to not only be a part of the victory parade in Moscow, but he would serve as the commander-in-chief for the entire event. Right? He's the big dude. This is the guy that's leading the parade. He led us to victory. He's leading the victory parade. So what I'm saying is that Stalin and the Soviet Union at this point are immortalizing the man that is Zhukov. And what's more interesting is while many men would have taken this moment to kind of bask in their, we'll say, newfound stardom, Zhukov was already thinking back to his job in Berlin. The night the parade ended, Zhukov would board a plane to pick back up exactly where he had left off, which was focusing on the rehabilitation of the German people in the Soviet-occupied zone. We must remember that during this time, the German people are in a horrible and an incredibly vulnerable spot. For the second time in less than 30 years, their nation has led them to brutal environments to survive in. One of the main things that the German people were lacking, and it started well before the end of the war, was food. The hunger of the German people rose to an alarming rate for not just the Soviet Union's occupied zones, but for all of the zones within Germany. In the American zone, a plan to give rations to German people had already begun by this point, and Zhukov could not stand by and wait any longer. So he sends an urgent request to Moscow asking for hundreds of thousands of tons in essential food items for the German people. Now, this is like beef, grain, dairy. You know, when you think of the essential items, like what does one need in order to survive? He's having literal tons of it brought from the Soviet Union into Germany in order to feed the German people. Zhukov also made it clear to his subordinates that their hatred for the Nazis should not be mixed with the respect of the German people. Right? This is a military leader. He is separating the German people from Nazis. The war's over. These are no longer, these aren't soldiers that we're shooting at and fighting. These are starving human beings, and their nationality does not matter. So to Zhukov, his job of eliminating the Nazi war machine, like I said, was complete, right? And the Germans left to pick up the pieces were no longer a threat to the Soviet Union. It was from May of 1945 until July of 1945 that Zhukov would organize and direct the initial plans to feed and restore the German people. But remember, right, what I said earlier, rehabilitating the Germans was only one step of this huge undertaking. A majority of those who were the directors of the global massacre, those that were still alive, that is, they were either sitting in confinement somewhere under the watchful eye of an ally soldier, or they were on the run attempting to start a new life. A lot of people say, well, how'd they do that? Rat lines. And we are going to do a huge series on that about the Nazi rat lines to mainly South America. Just know a strong majority of Nazis who escaped, who were criminals, ended up in South America. A really great example of that would be the quote-unquote architect of the Holocaust. That's a stretch. He was the logistical planner, but Adolf Eichmann. He ended up captured in South America by Mossad agents. So anyway, I'm getting off topic. The rat lines. So this is an unprecedented event. Never before has the world conducted such a plan to legally try people as war criminals. It was clear the Allied powers would need to figure this all out and scheduled the Potsdam Conference from July 16th to August 2nd, 1945. If you know anything about this moment in time, all right, Trinity test takes place during this, right? The United States detonates the first nuclear weapon in New Mexico. So there's a lot going on. This is a very tight and tense moment. FDR is dead, right? We have to remember that at this point he is dead. Harry Truman is now president of the United States. So this is kind of a very volatile time, even though the war in Europe just ended. But since Zhukov was the commander of the Soviet occupational zone and was also the newly appointed governor of Berlin, he was selected as the Soviet representative to attend the meeting. Now, there was more than Joseph Stalin went, right? But comparative to a Red Army representative, a representative of the Soviet military, it was Zhukov. And it was here that he would meet the other three commanders of their respective nations' occupied zones. And those members would be the U.S. Army General Dwight D. Eisenhower, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and French Marshal Jean de la Terre. And this is all happening for the very first time. It's the first time Zhukov has met them. Right? These are four men, three of which who had all met prior and had all worked together side by side to defeat the Nazis. Zhukov had been fighting the same exact fight against the Nazis, but on his own side by himself. So, it wasn't a multinational fighting force on the Eastern Front. I take that back. No, I don't. It was the Soviet Union. But while most people would probably resent, oh, well, here's these three dudes. They all know each other. They have a great professional relationship. They probably have a personal relationship. Most people would probably resent that in a sense, right? Or maybe allow their ego to grow a little bit ahead of them. I did this on my own. You guys had to use three nations. Instead, Zhukov and the other commanders actually got along really well. And he even developed an incredibly close relationship with U.S. General Eisenhower, who would go on to be president. Many considered the relationship between the two going forward to be one of the larger reasons why tempers didn't boil over at the beginning of the Cold War, right? They both understood and respected the actions in which they had to make in order to defeat the Nazis, and they were leaders of armies. We need to remember that. These are not just, these aren't captains, right? These aren't majors. These were the generals that directed the defeat of the Nazis. They're not politicians. Yet, they're not. That's funny, right? Because Eisenhower goes on to be president, and Zhukov, as we're going to learn, is going to go on to do other things in politics. But at this current time, they know they're not politicians. They are still leading an army. They are still military men. Their job is to not go to war and fight wars if it comes. So it's an interesting mix. And this is interesting, right? This kind of elevates Zhukov again. And the reason why is now he's got Western influence, right? He's favored by these Western allies. They like him. I mean, they like him so much that Eisenhower may or may not have helped Zhukov get clear Coca-Cola in the Soviet Union, right? If you've ever heard that story, Eisenhower's that connecting piece. However, with this new fame and this new likeness from the West and, slowly getting up there, right? Your social value is much higher. And that's a threat to Joseph Stalin. And if there's anything that you should recall from these episodes, it is that Joseph Stalin does not want a possibility of someone being so favored and so liked they somehow become more of a front runner to lead the Soviet Union and become a more popular of a leader to the people. Right? Stalin doesn't want opposition. It's why the purges happened in the 30s. It's why it took place. It was to eliminate any and all political adversaries to Stalin. These threats, if you will, to his power. These were speculations towards fellow Soviets. We gotta stop ourselves and think about that. Joseph Stalin was speculating against his own people and was killing them, or sending them to the gulags, which was pretty terrible, right? The purges in the 30s was terrible. After the war in the East ended, the love affair between the Soviet populace and members of the Soviet military expanded beyond what they had felt before. These men were placed on pedestals and treated as heroes that not only defeated the Nazis, but protected their homeland. And like we said, immediately following the war, Marshal Zhukov was the face of the victory for the Soviet Union. He led the parade, the victory parade in Moscow. He led it. He is the face of victory. By 1946, this stardom would not be hampered as he would officially be promoted to the commander-in-chief of all Soviet ground forces. Now, I know what you're saying. Didn't he already do this? Wasn't this already a position that he had? Absolutely not. During the Great Patriotic War, Zhukov would lead the Red Army, yes, but Stalin would never give up his power of being the commander-in-chief of the ground forces. There was always one more head, right? And it was Stalin. With this promotion, Zhukov would leave his post in Berlin and would head back to Moscow to officially take his new posting. So by the spring of 1946, right, he gets this promotion, I believe in February. I could be wrong on that. But by spring of 1946, Zhukov is at the top of his professional life. But to Stalin, Zhukov is becoming too liked and too influenced, right? So Stalin was not overly excited about his relationship with Eisenhower at all. Stalin believed that the exposure to the West would alter his priorities of being a Soviet commander, being a communist. Are you really in it all the way if you've got all these outside influences? His stardom and fame of leading the nation through the war had appeared to give him a chip on his shoulder. Stalin could not help to think that the way Zhukov was trending, he would only become a problem. Not only that, but he was going to become a threat. So while Stalin is, quite literally planning another purge of his government, just as he had previously done, with Zhukov, the hero of the Soviet Union, he could not simply be, shorted, right? He couldn't just be shot. He couldn't just be sent to the gulags. Something must be done to get rid of this threat, but he couldn't turn the people against him. At this point, the head of the Soviet Air Forces, a gentleman by the name of Marshal Alexander Novikov, provided a document to the Kremlin, and mainly to Stalin, that Marshal Georgy Zhukov was conspiring against him. And this would be, seriously, all it took in order for Stalin to sack Zhukov from his position and reassign him to the Odessa military district. For those of you who have no idea where Odessa is, it's a coastal town on the Black Sea in the Ukraine. So if you're looking at the Black Sea, it's kind of northeast. It's just on the water. It's a coastal town in Ukraine. It is far, far away from everything and everyone, right? In any way, this is a form of exile to Zhukov. But what's more interesting about this part is what did he conspire against Novikov? That's kind of an interesting point, right? Well, what did he conspire? Or what did he say? Well, from Novikov's own memoirs, many years later, nothing. A man who we were soon going to learn about, the People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, or as we know them as the NKVD, that'd be one Lavrentiy Beria. And he had a hand in this confession made to Stalin, right? So Novikov states that he was tortured, kept awake for days, and was given minuscule meals, right? And after nearly a week of this, Novikov would break. He would sign the confession. And by having this confession, Stalin was able to put forward and accuse Zhukov of Bonapartism and successfully removing him from power. Not even 2 full years since the war has ended, the great Soviet general is casted out. Zhukov, however, being a man who fulfilled the orders asked of him, wound up taking a near law enforcement sheriff type role in Odessa, which had been crippled by organized crime following the war. Ironically enough, this proved not to be too strenuous of a task for the man who played a key role in toppling the Nazis, and within a year of being in Odessa, the organized crime was almost completely eradicated. On the other side, right, sounds great. On the other side, there are rumors that his policy towards criminals was for his men to be the judge, jury, and the executioner. Regardless of how it was completed, Zhukov would remain in control of the Odessa region until 1948, when once again Stalin, who was fearful of Zhukov's popularity and the Soviet people, again moved him further away. This time was very different. Instead of sending him to a regional location with business and a dense population, he would send the man to command the Ural military district. So, for those of you who are, is that the Ural? Yeah, it's the Ural Mountains, which are situated about 1,800 kilometers from Moscow. For those of us in the United States, that's about 1,100 miles or so. For reference, that is about 100 miles longer than from New York City to Tampa, Florida. It's a long drive. Even here, Zhukov could not escape the grasp of Stalin's torment. Not soon after the arrival to the Ural military district, Zhukov was summoned to Moscow, where he was accused of looting during the Battle of Berlin. And this is really interesting and that this gets brought up against Zhukov because during the Battle of Berlin, the Soviet Red Army was given free rights to procure pieces of arts, museum artifacts, and rare metals to send them back to Moscow. In all, it is estimated that over 2.5 million pieces are stolen from Berlin during the battle and ultimately sent to the Kremlin. So it tends to be more of an ironic thing. Out of all things to poise a problem would be looting. In Zhukov's own terms, he stated that he had no need for such useless items. What I'm saying is, did it not happen? I mean, who knows, right? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But for Stalin, this is a personal looting, right? And to him, that's against doctrine. And he would be punished for what he did or did not do. And his punishment was accepting the Ural military district as a permanent posting. He would not be moved again. That is where he would go. That is where his career would die. So now we're 3 years separated from the end of the war, and Zhukov has been stripped of his legendary status within the Kremlin and is postmarked as a threat. In the same sense, the once glorious leader that had led the Soviet Red Army against an army set on destroying them had been washed away in political firestorm that stemmed from a jealous leader. Zhukov would remain in the Ural region until 1953. So, in the early part of 1953, a series of events are going to take place that would shoot Zhukov back into public image. In February, Nikolai Bulganin contacted Zhukov in the Ural military district and told him that he needed to come to the Kremlin for an urgent matter with Stalin, and that Stalin had finally relieved him of his command within the military district. Bulganin refused to tell Zhukov what exactly they were going to be speaking about, but was told they needed to be there as soon as possible. Zhukov was under assumption that this would be a meeting with Stalin to utilize his military prowess and knowledge on a possibility of a new war with the West now that the Korean War is in full swing. However, this meeting never takes place. While he was awaiting orders, Joseph Stalin would have a multitude of strokes on March 1st that would ultimately take his life 3 days later on the 4th. The man who ruled the Soviet Union during one of the most horrific wars in history was now dead. And now would be nothing left but an immense power struggle. But Zhukov's usefulness to some was not over yet. Following Stalin's death, as stated a minute ago, a power struggle did in fact ensue. Many members within the Kremlin, such as the now First Secretary, Georgy Malenkov, believed that it was time to end Stalinism in the Soviet Union. In the same exact breath, there were others who grew from the power of Stalin and wanted to keep it that way. Since so many military commanders from the Soviet Union were outcasted by the Kremlin following the war, it left the NKVD and, more importantly, Beria to get a grasp of armed power within the Soviet Union and really around Moscow. By the same time Stalin died, the Kremlin was no longer defended by the Moscow military district, but by those members of the NKVD. The military no longer had a presence in the capital city, which meant Beria had much more internal power than the military or its leaders. However, it was with the death of Stalin that caused immediate changes in the government. The deputy premier, Georgy Malenkov, would be elevated to the premier of the Soviet Union following Stalin's death, and he, along with his cabinet members such as Bulganin and the now first secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. They would quickly work together in order to end Stalinism and to end the threat that was Beria and the NKVD. However, Malenkov was not really a man of confrontation, and became increasingly worried that Beria's grasp was just simply too much. Bulganin and Khrushchev knew that if they were going to get rid of Beria, they were certainly going to need support of the Red Army. Bulganin, remember, is the Minister of Defense. Right? He turns to Zhukov and taps him as his deputy. This is interesting because at one point, Bulganin had a hand in getting Zhukov outcasted. He had worked with Beria to get the confession from Novikov, right? And Zhukov is aware of this. He knows that Bulganin had a hand in it. But Bulganin is not really the threat here to Zhukov. Well, they were aware that they had their own battle to fight. They chose to squash their indifferences, focusing on outing the issue directly in front of them. But it simply was not enough, even with the growing support from the Red Army. If they were going to topple Beria and NKVD, it would take a coup in order to defeat him. And that is exactly what they planned. Nikita Khrushchev would personally select Zhukov to lead the Red Army during the realignment of power, if you will, and to knock the NKVD and Beria out of the Soviet Union, not only because of the fact that he was Zhukov and the Red Army loved the man, but because Zhukov and Khrushchev had passed together. During the Great Patriotic War, Nikita Khrushchev served as the first secretary of the Bolsheviks, that's the Communist Party in the Ukraine, and was accused many times in the war by Stalin for a multitude of things, for the losses in places such as Kiev. And obviously, this is early on in Operation Barbarossa, and Stalin was pissed. And like I said, he put the blame on other people. Nikita Khrushchev was one of those. But Zhukov, who had also been in the region, would go against Stalin and prevent Stalin from sacking Khrushchev. So during this power struggle following Stalin's death, Khrushchev knew that he could call upon his reliable general Zhukov. Zhukov would agree. If you've ever seen The Death of Stalin, it's hilarious how it gets brought up. It's probably fake. I definitely highly suggest at least watching that snippet of the movie. It's pretty funny. However, that's most likely not how it happened. But so Zhukov would agree and assembled the Red Army to prepare for a coup against the NKVD and Beria, removing them from power on June 26, 1953, under the guise of a meeting with Khrushchev, Malenkov, and Beria at the Presidium. Now, Zhukov would literally burst through the door and officially arrest and detain Beria, forcefully removing him from power. Now, for those of you who have no idea how this ended for Beria, his quote-unquote trial, if you will, was not a real trial. Kangaroo court's really good. This was more of just a letting him know exactly what was getting ready to come to him, and that the Soviet Union was done with him, that he was a disgrace to the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. So this wasn't a trial. It was just letting him know that he was getting ready to die. Literally within 10 minutes of the end of the trial, he's taken out and shot. And now this did not all happen in June, right? A lot of people think that it happened in June. That's the way some films portray it. It didn't, right? He died in December of the same year, right? So 6 months later, he was executed. But with the removal of one of the last Stalinites in power, the Soviet Union now had an opportunity again to prosper, and Zhukov would be along for the ride this time, but not as a general, but as a politician. Now, it is because of this action during the demise of Beria that Khrushchev keeps Zhukov close and in power as the Deputy Minister of Defense until 1955, when Khrushchev would test the authority of Malenkov, right? So Malenkov was a proponent of not increasing the Red Army's budget, but to actually slash it significantly. This is during the Cold War, and there is an active war taking place in Korea solely based around communism and democracy. It's a really good spin on it. And Germany is now split into two separate nations, those of West Germany, who are under the direction of the American and the British governments, and East Germany, who is under the direction of the Soviets, right? A line is really solidified at this point. It was there with the occupational zones, but now the East and West Germany, this is the Berlin Wall, if you will, right? These are armed guards. They will shoot you if you try to go across. This is a very defining moment in history. To most, the last thing the Soviets need to be doing is slashing their military expenditures. Khrushchev would go on to not only challenge Malenkov with Zhukov's support again, but he would succeed in forcing him to resign in February. Well, most would think Khrushchev clearly is the next premier, right? He's doing all this. He's got to be next. It's wrong. It would be the Minister of Defense, Nikolai Bulganin. Now, with Bulganin as the premier, the Minister of Defense position is now open, and Zhukov is tapped to fill that role, effectively pacing him within the Presidium. Now, Khrushchev would stay in his role of the first secretary of the Communist Party, and this held a lot more control than people realized. But Malenkov was not totally out of the picture either. By June of 1957, the anti-party pact led by Malenkov and Molotov, let's go back a little, yep, that same Molotov attempted to depose Khrushchev. And for a minute, it certainly appeared that it was going to work. Until Georgy Zhukov once again arrives on the scene. Not only did he literally fly supporters in all from around Russia, but he openly stated and called members out that they were no better than Stalin, and what they were doing shares the same last name as Stalin's purges. They were so focused on ending Stalin's regime, why in the hell were they attempting to do the same thing? His aggressiveness and loyalty to Khrushchev would ultimately help Khrushchev in power. But not as it all seems, right? So this kind of seems like Zhukov and Khrushchev are best friends, and they're going to team up, and they're going to rule the Soviet world of politics and do some pretty great things for the Soviet people. I mean, just in this episode alone, right, we've heard that Zhukov saving Khrushchev's skin on 2 occasions, and he also did it during the war. But it is this newfound power that Khrushchev sees within Zhukov that makes him weary. This isn't Beria, a man hated and feared by all. Right? This is the marshal of victory. So Zhukov, from this point forward, would not only work to strengthen the Soviet military, but turn them into a professional fighting force. Now, Nick, are you insinuating that the Soviets did not have a professional military during the Great Patriotic War? Yeah, it's exactly what I am saying. Even more so, Stalin didn't want a professional military as it could create an avenue to become too powerful. It is one of the reasons that the Great Purge happened. Now, we must remember that Stalin kept his power high, but everyone else is in check. And for Zhukov, there needed to be a clear separation between politics and the military. Communism or not, it doesn't change the way an army will fight. So he begins to remove things from the military, such as commissars and advisors that are attached to military units, right? With his goal clear, the military should run itself, not the Communist Party. In October of 1957, while on a trip to Yugoslavia, Khrushchev would organize a secret plenum that would await for his return on the 26th. Now, the 26th is a kind of weird date, isn't it, right? That's when he's called back from Bulganin to go meet Stalin. And now, again, on another 26th, they're waiting for him. The Kremlin is awaiting his arrival, and he has no idea that it's coming. Once he returned, Zhukov would be yet once again accused of Bonapartism, political adventurism, and, of course, attempting to cut ties with the party. But unlike all of the times that Zhukov stuck his neck out for his fellow Soviets, none of them would do the same for him. And it was on that date, October 26th, the day that he returned and was accused, he would be completely removed from power and forced into retirement. Now, Georgy Zhukov would spend the rest of his life away from the world. An avid outdoorsman, he would slip away from politics and the military completely after his sacking. While he would have some restoration to his public figure before he would die, receiving the Order of Lenin in 1966, and he would be allowed to go on and publish his autobiography. And of course, this would only take place after Khrushchev's fall from power in 1964. On June 18, 1974, at the age of 77, Zhukov would die from a stroke in Moscow. It is still to this day that Zhukov is considered one of the key people behind the fall of Nazi Germany around the world, and is still considered a hero to many. Even after his death, the Soviet Union revitalized the remembrance and honor of the man. After his death, he was honored with having his ashes buried at the Kremlin Wall necropolis alongside other Soviet heroes and leaders. All right, man, what a couple episodes, huh? What I anticipated being one episode really quickly turned into 3, because not only does history deserve that, but all of you deserve that as well. Once again, massive special thanks to Dr. John Mann from Arizona State University for leading me through all of this, and mainly just the second episode. Without his guidance, I would have been screwed on this episode. I would have been screwed on the last episode. His in-depthness of going over information with me and helping me understand it was critical. So, Dr. Mann, thank you. And with that, I'm hoping to have him on the podcast later this year to give us some really, really good information about the Great Patriotic War. With that, too, I think we are really looking towards some special episodes this year with quite a few guests lined up to come speak. We will be doing some combined shows. There will be researchers, professors, authors coming on to speak and talk about a plethora of topics from the Second World War. I am incredibly excited to see where this all goes. As always, make sure you leave us a like and review wherever you listen. Follow up on all socials and World on Fire podcast. Oh yeah. Hey, of course. How can I forget? Right. What's next, Nick? Well, let's talk about something other than major players, shall we? The ones that we all hear about. Let's talk about some of the fiercest fighters nobody ever talks about. The Gurkha soldiers of the British Empire, fighting on 3 major theaters of operation with only 120,000 men. They would lose nearly 25% over the course of the war. I look forward to talking about the tradition, the implementation, and the warriors that the Gurkhas provided during World War II. I look forward to going into all of it. As always, thank you all so much for coming back every week. I'll see you in 2 weeks.